Generative AI is here, and it has changed the rules of the game. Experts like Seth Godin and Robert McKee have been very clear. The authors who are going to make it in this business are those who are writing truly amazing, knock your socks off innovative stories. The bar is that high. AI will replace mediocre writers. But at some point, everybody is mediocre. So what do? You educate yourself. And the good news is that there's still time, but you've got to start leveling up right away. I'm Valerie Francis, and I've got a series of webinars to help you do just that. My specialty is helping authors like you put theory into practice. Understanding the tools of our trade and being able to apply them with precision is no longer an option. It's an absolute necessity. So go to valeriefrancis.ca/webinars for more information and sign up for the notifications. You can't afford not to.
If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie and I look back over season 7 and discuss what we've learnt about character development and world building in the real world. And of course, we'd love it if you could give our show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll down to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, why don't you start us off by telling us what your big aha moments were with respect to character development?
Well, I have a bit of a confession to make. The movies I proposed this season weren't my first choices. When we were planning this season, we had just recorded the season 6 episode on Manchester by the Sea. Now, that was a heavy movie. In fact, most of the film choices last season were pretty heavy, so I decided that I wanted to lighten things up a little bit. But I think I overreacted. I think the pendulum swung too far the other way. And most of the movies I chose were rather light on character development. So one of my big aha moments is that I should have gone with my original film choices, which, yes, were heavier, but they were more character driven. So in my personal study, I am going to go back and look at those movies as well. Now, in saying this, I have to admit that I was quite pleased, relieved maybe is a better word, with Bridget Jones's Diary, Big, and Pretty Woman. There's a lot more to Bridget and Vivian than first meets the eye. And with Josh and Big, well, let's just call a spade and admit that the movie owes an awful lot to Tom Hanks's charm and comedic timing. But even Josh grows in maturity, and we know that because of his decision to return home and enjoy his childhood. So even if you're writing a lighthearted story, you can, and must, in my opinion, demonstrate that your character is somehow different at the end than they were at the beginning, and that difference occurs because of the journey that they've gone on. Now, the main point of theory that I focused on this season is that a character is revealed through action under pressure. Pressure builds as the story goes along, of course, so if the pressure is slight, only a minor character trait will be revealed. Among my choices this season, Fatal Attraction is the clear standout with respect to character development. So if you've not heard that episode yet, I encourage you to go back and listen to it. What fascinated me most about that episode, or about that movie, I guess, is how the audience's perception of a story and about a character can change over time. Sometimes characters don't change in a story at all. What changes is our perception of them. Typically, that happens as we watch a movie or read a novel for the first time. So our perception of the character changes from the beginning to the end. In other words, they're not who we thought they were when the story first started. But as is the case with Fatal Attraction, a viewer's perception of a character can actually change in chronological time. So what I mean by that is my perception of Alex has changed from who I thought she was when I first saw the movie in the late 80s, early 90s, to who I think she is now that I watched the film through my own changed worldview. Now, Melanie, if I look at your film choices, I've got to say that The Boy in the Striped Pajamas stands out to me because in that movie, the protagonist intentionally does not change or shift in any way. He's exactly who we think he is, an innocent child, and he's exactly the same at the end of the movie as he was at the beginning of the movie. And that's the point. It isn't a flaw in the storytelling. Instead, in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, it's the father, who is actually the antagonist, who has the depth and layers that we typically expect from a protagonist. Now, could that kind of thing work if the protagonist was an adult? Well, I have no idea. I guess in the right hands it could work. I mean, if the author is truly a master of the craft. Otherwise, I think it's a risky business. Melanie, what do you think?
Ah, well, that's interesting, your confession. But also the things that you picked up on as well were very similar, although slightly different for me. So I know you were very focused on character being revealed when that character is under pressure. But for me, I think the biggest aha moment was also watching The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, because I found Bruno's father the most fascinating and interesting character in that movie. And that's because he was the most complicated character in the story. So he was on one hand a loving father and a loving husband, and then on the other hand he was a Nazi and the commandant of a concentration camp where Jews were tortured and killed. So these personality traits are diametrically opposed, but we shouldn't be surprised by this because humans are full of these contradictions all the time. And this tapped into something for me that is obvious, but I haven't really been able to articulate it very well until recently and listening to you talk about character and character development over this season. So I'm going to try, so bear with me, okay? So when I watch the news, and there are many stories about people who have committed horrible crimes, the neighbours, the family members and the community groups, when they're interviewed, are surprised or in disbelief about their son, their mate, their husband's arrest or the things that they are alleged to have done. It's like we expect people to be exactly who they present themselves as, and that everything that you see is what you get. And sometimes we think that people are that simple. You know, we expect top bloke Dave from the footy club who coaches the under 12s to be exactly the same person when he goes home to his family. And it surprises us to learn that Dave may actually beat his partner and his kids. So people are complex. So we shouldn't be surprised when a person we think we know behaves differently when they are with us compared to how they act with others. And to that end, our characters, if we want them to be interesting, must have the potential to be full of contradictions. Now, Valerie, you mentioned what Robert McKee calls character dimensions, which, put simply, is the existence of contradictions within a character. And I think the more contradictions or dimensions a character has, the more interesting they are to the reader. So that was really revealed to me this season in listening to what you were learning about or what you were examining with character development.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in terms of, one thing to keep in mind as you're coming up with your characters, you're creating your character and writing your stories. And to be honest, I'm not sure if this is a takeaway from this season in particular, but it's something that we need to keep in mind. And here it is. Many of the story problems that writers run into are because they don't know their protagonist well enough. And because they don't know their protagonist, they don't know their antagonist. So if you're running into issues with your story, go back to your main character and get really clear on who that person is on a deep, profound level. not what they look like necessarily or do for a living or what they had for breakfast. Instead, ask yourself things like, what is the main character's hopes or dreams or fears? What is it that's causing her to act the way she acts? And she may not even be aware of it, by the way, but you, as the author, as the creator of this world, need to be aware of it. I mean, that's the stuff that we want to know. I do recommend Robert McKee's work on character 100%. But if his work confuses you, because it does take a little while to wrap your head around it, try studying yourself. Get into personal development. Why do you do the things that you do? If, for example, you find it difficult to discipline yourself to write on a consistent basis, why? What's going on there? The same kind of work that you would do on yourself to get to the bottom of those types of questions, to change your own habit and to grow as a person yourself, well, that's exactly the same kind of work that you do when you're developing a fictional character. Okay, so moving on to world building then. Melanie, what did you discover this season?
Well, I loved my topic this season because I challenged myself to study world building in what, I'll call the real world. This topic isn't given as much focus as it should, but it is touched upon in some theory books under the heading of setting, but I don't think that setting does this element of craft justice. Well, that's my opinion anyway. So first of all, what I learnt was that the physical space in a story is meant to generate emotion in order to illuminate character and also to suggest the story's symbolic underpinning. So the world of the protagonist, therefore, is crucial to telling their story. Now, if this idea is new to you, here are 3 key points to consider, first of all, when world building in the real world for your protagonist. Now, there are 3 key points to start with to remember about building your story world. And the first is that the reader has never been there. So readers don't know the fictional world of your characters like you do. So you must create the world for them and build the world so that the reader understands the lives of your characters. Secondly, the story world is a sensory world, and that the characters must react to the sensory stimuli in that world in the same way that people would react in the real world. So put sensory stimulus into your world and consider which sensory cues you want to draw the reader's attention to as you create that world. And thirdly, that the story world is a subjective world. So we should think about the way our protagonists and our characters experience that world and how they react to the world and what happens in it based on their internal thoughts and feelings, their wants and needs, and their own values. Then there's the surroundings. So what is it that's in the world that the characters respond to with their senses? What sort of society and culture is the protagonist world's like? What symbols or commonly understood things are we going to use in that story world to orientate the reader in time and also with the type of culture that they are in? And then there's the setting and the landscape. So how does the world look and what physical features does the world have? Now, the other surprising pattern that I noticed this season was that all the movies we studied were very deliberate about the places where the story took place. Generally speaking, there were 3 main types of settings in the story world, with a number of smaller places that featured, but to a lesser degree. So, for example, in Bridget Jones's diary, Bridget's world is primarily in London, England, but most of the time, Bridget operates in 3 main groups of people, but in 4 main settings. And I found this fascinating because this was relatively consistent across all the movies that we watched this season. So start with a small number of settings or setting types and choose the ones that serve your story the best. So be conscious of where your characters are acting out the story and consider the size of the story world that they occupy. Now, these are very practical takeaways, and I think that they will help you create your story world. But Valerie, did you learn anything new about world building this season?
I did, yes, but just as you were speaking, an idea came to me that I don't think I brought up at all during the season, so I just want to mention it here. World building and character development go hand in glove. Why? Because a character behaves differently depending on the environment that they're in. So if you've got Bridget Jones, for example, being around her family is going to bring out certain aspects of her personality, certain aspects of her character. When she's at work, different aspects of her character are revealed because it's a different type of pressure. So there's a direct link between the world that you are building for your character and the situations that you put her in, and what it is you want to reveal about who she is. And I don't think I said that this season, so I just wanted to take a minute to talk about it now. Okay, world building. I had never heard of the concept of a primary and secondary world before, so that was really interesting to me. And that came up in episode 4 when we studied District 9. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, go back and check it out. The other thing that really caught my eye was how the world is particular to the protagonist. Now, on an intellectual level, that seems obvious, but it's only when we looked at the same setting in different movies and how it related to different protagonists that I really appreciated how it worked. For example, New York City was the setting for 3 films this season: Can You Ever Forgive Me, Fatal Attraction, and Big. But New York City is like 3 totally different places given the character's journey and the genre, of course. Now, you just went over a whole bunch of the theory, Melanie, like that you talked about throughout the course of the season. So I don't have a whole lot more to add than that. But of all the stuff that you learned this season, what is the one thing that you would like people to take away and bring into their own writing rooms as they sit down and work on their own stories?
Well, I think the biggest and most helpful concept in world building, like you mentioned, is the concept of the primary and the secondary worlds. Now, the primary world is the world in which we live, and this is a reference point for all other worlds. It is also worth noting there that primary world is a subjective world as well, right? It is the world that we know and the world that we reference, and it's going to be different for every person depending on their life experience. Now, the secondary world is the imaginative world. And what I found really fascinating and something to really consider when you're building fictional worlds is that the primary and the secondary worlds are hierarchical. The secondary world needs the primary world in order to exist, just because the primary world is the reference world of which all other worlds then can exist or be compared to. Now, the most fascinating aspect about the primary world and the secondary world is that they belong on a spectrum, where the primary world is the starting point for the spectrum, and then the secondary worlds move along the spectrum based on how similar or different they are from the primary world. And the more deviation away from the primary world that we have in a story, so the more the secondary world deviates from the primary world, the more sub-creation or world building is required. And this sub-creation takes time because we as authors have to provide the reader with information about the world. Now, this may slow down the narrative, but the richness of a new world can be an important part of the audience's experience of your story. So creating the world also provides scope for mood and atmosphere. And a compelling world and a compelling story are 2 different things, but they can coexist and they can both be interesting. So in summary, the biggest takeaway about world building that I have is that the further away from the primary world your story is, then the more time you must spend explaining that world.
Alrighty. So what do you have coming up for season 8?
Well, season 8, I'm going to study conflict with a focus on the internal and external conflict for the protagonist. What about you?
Well, for me, seasons 6, 7, and 8 are all on the theme of character. In season 6, I studied empathy. Season 7, obviously, character development. And in season 8, I'm going to be looking at cast design. Now, everything I know about this, I learned from Robert McKee. Again, we're back to McKee, but that's because when it comes to stories and storytelling, he knows more than just about anyone else. So when I learned the concept of cast design and I saw how it was applied, I'm not even kidding, it revolutionized my writing. That is not hyperbole, it's actually true. It was one of those moments when the fog lifted for me and I suddenly had a whole new understanding of how stories work. So I'm hoping that I can convey a little bit of what I've learned next season for you all.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. I can't wait. It'll be good. All right, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discussed August Osage County. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca Inner Circle and follow her on X and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find out about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.